Thanks. And my other hat is actually I'm the director of the Difference, Power, and Discrimination program. And I want to put in a little plug for those of you who are instructors and faculty. Every summer we have a 3-week seminar on curriculum transformation, and it looks at how do you integrate more of this diversity content into your discipline. And that seminar this year will be June 21st through July 9th. It's Monday through Friday, 9 to 1 every day. We have really good snacks for you the whole time. And if you're a 9-month faculty, we pay you $2,500 for it. And if you're 12-month faculty, we put $1,000 in a faculty development account for you to use. If you're interested, when you get back to your office, send me an email. I'll send you the application form with some more information. But it takes a lot of the things we're going to talk about today and just really explores them in a lot of depth. So to start off, we're actually going to do a little checklist to see what you know about what goes on our campus. So start off and just do the front page. Don't flip it over at this point. What do you know that we do or don't have at OSU, or what do you have questions about? What did you notice as you filled this out?
Well, some of them I thought we must have a policy, but I don't really do.
So we're not doing a good job necessarily of advertising what we do have. Well, what would be an example of that one?
What policy for dealing with bias?
Yes, we do, and we actually have a bias response team that you can call when there's been an issue of bias who will step in, and it's people from student affairs and public safety and a number of other groups. Yeah. Good. What else?
Well, there's a question here. I'm not sure. All students required to take a course on explicit diversity focus?
Yeah, that's actually where the DPD program comes in. Yeah. There's an entire category for difference, power, and discrimination. We have about 40 courses in it across campus. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What else?
There's just a couple I wasn't sure about. Recognize diversity efforts in your promotion in your process.
That's a good one. And it varies, actually. We don't really have a university-wide established way of doing that. So it really ends up being departmental and college where the emphasis gets put on that. And so that's one of those places we could do a lot better, actually. Yeah. What else? Hi. Other questions? Yeah.
I wasn't sure either about encourage and fund research with a diversity focus.
Yeah, not really. Okay. You know, it's the sort of thing that if you're doing it, and if you find the funding, and if it's there, that's great, but we don't really have that same level of commitment to that as an explicit focus. But certainly it's supported if somebody's doing something that centers on that.
The last one that we were not sure is whether we do evaluate administrators, departments, and faculties in relation to diversity efforts. It's pretty much positive. I'm pretty sure we do.
Yeah, and again, it's spotty in its application. I mean, you may know that we all had to come up with diversity plans for our units at all the different levels. And so we would assume evaluation is part of that for the people implementing those plans. But again, it's been pretty spotty at this point. So I think we could do better at actually implementing the plans we say we're going to implement. But at least we've paid some attention to it. And as I travel around other universities, that in itself is actually pretty good, that we even have diversity action plans for each unit. So we're not doing badly at all in this way, but there's certainly also room for improvement. Were there any others that you noticed or had a question about?
There's one question about having fully accessible classrooms and offices. I don't know, does that mean every classroom or some? I know some are, but not everyone.
No, not everyone. No, and in fact, if you're in a wheelchair, you can't even get to your sociology professors because Fairbanks doesn't have an elevator. So no, we're not fully accessible. And in some of the places we're accessible, say for people in wheelchairs, it's awkward to get to the ramp. I mean, this building.
Well, it's by the trash.
Yes, yeah. And so we do have some work to do there, and of course we know about all the funding problems and all the deferred maintenance anyway, and so that just becomes a part of that larger picture of we haven't kept up our buildings well because of the funding issues, and when we have put things in, sometimes they've ended up in awkward places. So yes, more work to do there. Okay, so now you've been thinking about what the university's doing. What I want you to do now is flip it over and just think about some of the things that you do as a teacher. So take just a few minutes to go through that list. What are the ones you do really well? Yeah, John.
Well, and I teach a class in strategy, and so one of the elements of strategy is having different perspectives, and I use that as an opportunity to encourage diverse thinking, and actually take them through a physical exercise where they look at things differently, by standing on their chairs and sitting on the floor to kind of get an idea for how things look when they get in different perspectives.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great activity. Good. There's a good example. What else? Others? Where did you find yourself going, all right, I'm doing really well here?
I don't ask other students of other groups to speak for their group. I have a friend from Japan and she hates that. It happens to her all the time.
Yeah, it's distressing how often I hear students say that, kind of, well, what do black kids think about this? Or, what do gay folks or what do women think about it? Yeah. So we do have to be careful not to ask people to speak for their group. Somebody asked me, well, what do white people think about this? As if I can speak for all white people, but yeah. What are some of the ones that you went, oh, perhaps I should work on this one a little bit?
The idea of evaluating students in different ways, or to take difference into account, particularly different learning styles, and remembering to focus that in different ways of doing assignments and stuff is sometimes challenging.
It really is because, we tend to teach in the ways that we were taught, and if we're comfortable with those, it's pretty easy to get into that routine and to forget that students learn in different ways. There are a lot of really good learning styles inventories out there, and Peter could probably help you with some of those if you were interested. But they really show how students learn in different ways, and I found them helpful because they converted me from being basically your sort of stand-up and lecture kind of person to being much more experiential, because the more I gave them, the more I realized that most of my students were not abstract thinkers like I am, but they were much more concrete, emotional, applied thinkers. And so I really shifted. I found a model, and you probably know David Kolb's work, and that work in experiential learning, and I've learned to apply that. But you really do have to be conscious about it. I mean, it's not just something that comes to us naturally. Yeah. What about some others that you thought, well, maybe I could work on that one a little bit?
I wondered what inclusive language was. I sort of sat there and went, what is inclusive language? What would that be?
Well, it could be, the most blatant is not referring to, mankind, but talking about humankind, for example. I teach religion sometimes, and so I always talk about God as God. There's no he, him, that kind of language. And so when we use examples, do we automatically go to he as the pronoun for the scientist he, the teacher he, the maintenance worker he. And so inclusive language makes us feel that anybody could be part of this language. And so gender is the one, of course, being women's studies, that comes to mind most easily, but I think we have to think about that in a lot of ways. In our assumptions when we use language, are we assuming that everybody's an English speaker? Are we assuming everybody's white? Are we assuming everybody's straight? So do we talk about husbands and wives, or we talk about partners? In some states I can talk about spouses and it would be inclusive, but not ours. And so it's sort of thinking that way, how do we include everyone in the words that we use, especially when we're talking about sort of larger groups or undefined people, rather than an individual person in front of us. Well, what we're going to do today is really sort of look in detail at more of these issues, and we're going to start off and I'm going to talk a little bit about what students from certain diverse populations often experience in classrooms, and then we'll talk some about what you can do to make your classroom more inclusive for these folks. And given we have a limited amount of time, I'm just going to focus on some primary groups. So we're going to look at students of color, we're going to look at women, LGBT students, students with disabilities. Because of course we could talk about religion as an issue, we could talk about age, so there are a lot of other things we could do, but just for the sake of time, we'll narrow it down. And you'll get the point, because a lot of the things that I'll suggest are things we ought to do and will benefit all of our students. Even the students from the dominant group benefit from these. And then some will be specific to the groups that we're talking about. So with that, we'll just jump right in. And a concept that's been helpful for me to think about what students often experience in our classrooms comes from Bernice Sandler. And Bernice is known as the godmother of Title IX. So she was very involved in writing Title IX, which is the Equity in Education Act. And particularly these days, a lot of times we don't see the really blatant forms of discrimination happening in our classrooms. And we're not calling people ugly names. We're not doing bad things based on these differences. But what happens are these micro inequities. The things that happen every day that are little things that in and of themselves probably wouldn't matter that much, but when they begin to happen day in and day out, time and time again, it just gets old. So for example, some of the micro inequities students in our classrooms may experience. Referring to the males as men and the females as girls. Pardon? Yeah, and it happens a lot. Calling women things like honey, baby, sweetheart, and they may be well-intended and all of that, but they have this sort of infantilizing effect that somehow, because you wouldn't probably call your male students honey, baby, sweetheart. Talking out groups or people in ways that reinforce stereotypes, those hot-blooded Latinas or those foppish gay guys or whatever. But just as ways we sort of assume things about groups. Focusing on women's appearance rather than their accomplishments, or describing women by their appearance. And that may be as simple as, excuse me, you in the red shirt over there, and you, John. And it's amazing how often, and both men and women will do that sort of thing. So it's not even a gendered response on the part of the instructor, but it's something that we sort of learn in our culture, that we think of women in terms of their appearance. Assigning tasks according to stereotype roles. So we have a group, let's make the woman the note taker. And that's the kind of thing that can happen, especially in things like engineering, where women are by far in the minority in classes, and that'll happen very often in the groups where women end up as note takers. Interrupting, talking over, or ignoring women or people of color. And again, we learn different ways of having conversations. And so what you'll notice very often if you go into a meeting and there are a lot of men and a few women, that very often the women will get talked over, interrupted, their ideas will get repeated as someone else's. And again, there's all this research supporting this. Attributing achievements to good luck, affirmative action, or attractiveness. Calling on males and whites more frequently, and again, this is something both men and women instructors will do. Giving women and people of color easier tasks or easier questions. So I might ask a white student a critical thinking question, and then turn around and ask a Latino student a fact-based question, which of course is much easier, different set of skills. Asking somebody to speak for his group, we just talked about that. Making sexist, racist, or heterosexist comments or jokes. And again, these are the kind of things that if you only heard one in a lifetime, you could probably let it pass. But it adds up after a while when you hear it day in and day out. Ridiculing or denigrating issues that belong to a group. So making things like inclusive language, sort of mocking that somehow that's important, because mankind really can represent us all, and what's wrong with these feminists that they're making mountains out of molehills. And refraining from offering helpful critique and challenge. So not expecting or demanding the same level of achievement from a member of one of these groups. So you can see where these things in and of themselves aren't always going to be a big deal, but when they happen all the time, they begin to add up. I mean, one of my pet peeves is students send me emails addressed to Mrs. Shaw, for example. Drives me crazy, because that is my mother. I am not Mrs. in any way, form, or fashion, and to them, they think they're being polite, and yet I find it insulting day in and day out because it's Dr. Shaw or it's Professor Shaw, not Mrs. Shaw. I remember when I was taught at another institution, I was the only woman in the department, and there was one man in the department who did not have a PhD. Inevitably, students came in and they asked for Dr. Favre, and then they asked for Mrs. Shaw. And it used to just make me nuts. And again, this is something you'll often hear women in academia talk about. So I found out it's not just me, that this happens to women all the time. The sort of assumption either that you don't have your PhD, or if you do, it's still more polite. Somehow it's too harsh to call you doctor or professor. So that's just one of my little pet peeves. So let's jump in and let's talk a little bit about race and how do we pay attention to the things that happen to students of color in our classrooms. And so here's some questions that you might want to ask yourself. So part of this work really is self-examination. It's getting in touch with your own issues, the biases that you bring to the classroom, because we all have them. So it's not a bad thing to say that we have these biases. We are in a culture where these things are just part of the air we breathe, and so we learn this stuff. The secret, though, is becoming aware of it so that we don't then turn around and sort of perpetuate forms of oppression in our classroom. So take a minute and read through those. So how would you imagine if somebody came to the classroom holding some or all of these assumptions, how might that play out for students of color? What do you think their experience in the classroom would be like?
I'm sorry, could you ask that again? I was reading.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. That if someone holds this, an instructor holds these assumptions and comes to the classroom with this, what might students of color experience in this instructor's classroom?
Probably feel marginalized because they weren't being included in the conversations.
Yeah, I mean, they're being treated as outsiders, they're being treated as less than. What else?
And that might result in performing that way. I mean, treating someone as if they're underprepared or less qualified oftentimes results in them feeling or acting less qualified.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of research shows that students will very often live up or down to our expectations of them. Yeah. What else?
I wouldn't feel very comfortable with the instructor, and probably not. I would feel like they're approachable, so if I do have questions or something, I probably wouldn't ask them.
Yeah. And then, of course, we see how that compounds itself because then you're not getting the same level of assistance. And that goes back then to Claire's point about it becomes sort of self-defeating. You don't do as well. And that actually holds to be true, that if a student doesn't feel like the professor expects much of him or her, respects him or her, student's not going to go and get help, not going to perform as well. Another question that we can ask is sort of how we interact with these students. So we've got our beliefs, and then we have these interactions. So take a second and read these. And I imagine as you read these, you can sense how for white professors it would be easy to come to the classroom feeling these things about interactions, again, because we learn all of this sort of stuff. And you can see then how it would reproduce those micro inequities over and over again that students of color would experience. And then the behavior questions, and we'll come back to these a little bit later on. But some things we can do to sort of check ourselves to see, are we treating students of color equitably in our classrooms? So are we calling on students of color as often as others? And sometimes it's hard. We have to break ourselves of old habits because, for example, our inclination is to call on the first hand that goes up, right? And typically the first hand up are those are the students who are comfortable speaking in class. They're the students who've been rewarded for speaking up and for being good students. And so a lot of times other students who don't feel part of the dominant group are going to be a little slower to get their hands up. And so sometimes we have to not call on that first person and wait until we see the hands of other people. And that holds true also for women as well as for students of color. The next one, this was really interesting. I had to learn this one in kind of an interesting way. I was teaching a course a few summers ago, and I had in it a number of African-American football players, mostly who were from the LA area. And we were talking about some issue, and suddenly they were all talking at the same time to one another and to the class. And for me as a white instructor who likes things to be very linear and in order and one at a time and let me call on you, it felt chaotic. But what I realized was they were on topic. They understood what they were saying. And it was the white folks who were freaking out about it. And that was important to me to realize that there are other modes of academic discourse that may not be the ones I'm comfortable with. There's a great article that a feminist writer talks about this as gubbo yaya. This is the term she uses. That basically means everybody talking at the same time. And yet everybody who's used to doing this knows exactly what's going on. And so it was really hard for me to step back and let them continue that conversation without interrupting and saying, oh, no, 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 let's raise our hands and speak one at a time. Because it was very different. And it wasn't the thing that happens sometimes when people are having side conversations. It was a very different experience. And so for me, it was sort of a cultural awakening to realize, oh gosh, there are other ways to do this that are appropriate and effective. And again, I think that these questions allow us to think about ways we can pay attention to our own behaviors. Because again, most of this stuff is not stuff that we do intentionally. In fact, we're not even aware of it most of the time. And we really have to train ourselves to think about, how am I interacting? Who am I calling on? Who am I ignoring? Whose issues am I talking about? You know, who's pushed off to the side? And so we'll come back in a minute and I'll go through some sort of helpful hints and tips that'll help us think about this. But I want to move on and talk about another group, women, and talk about the chilly climate. Again, I'm going to return to the work of Bernice Sandler. And what she says is that for women, all these micro inequities add up to create what she calls a chilly climate in higher education. And so here's some of the things that she says that instructors can do to women in the classroom that create this chilly climate. Behaviors that communicate lower expectations for women. And I imagine most of us can think of ways or times where, you know, we've seen this happen. Those of us who are women may have experienced this for ourselves. When there's just the expectation we're not quite as good at math or engineering or agriculture. Believing the stereotypes that we've learned. And so we treat women as a stereotype rather than as an individual. Excluding women from participation. And this can be, you know, specifically ignoring women, or even addressing a group as if there were no women present. That used to happen when I taught religion. I was often the only woman in the room because the religion department, the faculty would meet with pastors, and in this context they were all males. And it actually did my soul some good for them to have to go, gentlemen and lady, because, you know, at that point I refused to be the shrinking violet and not be visible in that group. And yet the assumption was, who had the right to be in that room? It was men. I was an intruder on their space. I was an interloper. And had I not had the experience of already having gone through seminary and had sort of a feminist consciousness raising experience there, I think it would have been a lot harder to be in that room than it was. Treating men and women differently when their behaviors are the same. We see this all the time. I mean, you know, men are, you know, assertive and powerful and strong, and women are bitches for doing exactly the same thing. And we can see this again and again. You know, or attributing when women do something, it's affirmative action, or it's their beauty, or, you know, they slept with somebody to get there. It's never about they are equally talented, they're equally good at this. Giving women less attention and intellectual encouragement. That's the really subtle stuff. Sometimes the ways that we look people in the eyes. We're going to be much more likely to make eye contact with our male students. And again, both men and women professors, teachers do this because we've all learned this stuff. Like I said, we're going to call on men more often. We're going to use men's names more often. And all of those things, again, add up to an experience for women students of feeling like they don't belong, that they're not on center in our classroom.
So how do I mean, I have males in my class that speak out first. How do I squelch them? Do I just call them and say, I know you know, but I want to know if they know? Or how do you squelch?
Yeah, I've actually, when I've had some classes where certain students dominated the conversation, I've done a couple of activities to help them learn to monitor themselves. And one of my favorite ones is I go in and I give everybody like 3 little chips, like, you know, get poker chips or something. And basically, the way the activity goes is that every time they speak, they have to give up a chip. once they're out of chips, they don't get to speak anymore. And everybody has to use at least one chip. And so that gets people who've never spoken. Now, if somebody has used up all 3 and they really want to say something, they can try to get one person in class to give them one extra chip. But nobody has to. And I've been amazed at how the dynamics of the class change after that, because the people who have talked so much suddenly begin to self-monitor, and they start going, is this important enough for me to say I'm going to give up, a third of my chips, or should I wait? And what happens is, as they're thinking about that, the people who never speak have a little space. And they're going, okay, well, I got to use one, I better speak up now. And my experience has been very often that will change the dynamics of the class for the rest of the term, because they start to pay attention, yeah. But that's another one of those good examples of how we have to be intentional about helping students not reproduce these dynamics in our classroom. Yeah, but that's pretty tough. And then this one, too, I think we have to be careful about, too, is making sure that we attribute women's ideas to women. I mean, it's amazing how much this still goes on. I've had this happen to me here at this university, where I've said something, my idea, but in the history of the university, it's been credited to particular men who happened to be in the same room and repeat it after I said it. And so we have to be very careful that when a woman speaks up, that we do credit her with what she said. Because again, that affirms her, and it lets her, so that we value her input as a part of the classroom. Discouraging women through politeness. And this one, again, is one of those really subtle ones, because we think we're being nice when we do this, and really we're undercutting, again, women's competence. And so, yeah, you think about, and I can just see these things going on like in a computer classroom, an engineering classroom, where, the young men wanting to be nice kind of come and take over. And what they really do then is take away from women that opportunity to experience sort of the hands-on competence that we build when we do things for ourselves. And then again, the issue of lower standards. We're not doing our students favors when we think, well, she's a girl, and so I'm not going to expect so much out of her in this complicated technological stuff. We think we're being nice, but we're really doing harm to her. And then, yeah, the stuff like, don't tell the jokes because there are ladies present. I mean, it's like, don't tell the jokes because they're sexist, regardless of who's present. And so again, don't let our attempts to be polite and nice and do the right thing actually become part of maintaining these structures that harm our students. And then, of course, singling out women. What do you women think about this? And then the whole issue of touching is a very interesting one. And it's faculty, we have to be very careful about this anyway. But men, both male students and male faculty, are much more likely to touch women, both women students and women faculty, as if they sort of have permission to do that. And while something may be a friendly touch and it's signaled that way and there's no intent of anything problematic, it does convey a certain paternalistic attitude, especially when you're not touching your male colleagues and your male students in the same ways and as much. And again, you see how that becomes one of those micro-inequities. So, you can become like mom and daddy, sort of pat. And so it's not always perceived as being supportive. It may actually do the opposite of that. And then this is a really big one, defining women by their sexuality. So relating to women in a sexual manner, making sexual comments about women. And it could be toward the specific woman in front of you, or it can be about women as a group. And again, the sort of notion of praising women for their physical appearance rather than their intellectual abilities. And then there's the whole thing of somehow denigrating unfeminine women, because we have this assumption that women are supposed to be a particular way. Using the words lesbian and bisexual as pejorative terms. I always tell my students, frankly, if you're a strong woman, sooner or later you're going to be called a lesbian. So if nobody's called you a lesbian, you're probably not working hard enough yet. And the thing to do is to embrace it, because the term only has power as long as people are afraid of it. And if people, straight women in particular as allies, will embrace the term and not respond to it, not say, no, I'm not say, well, straight but not narrow, but just say, okay, whatever, then it takes away any power that term has to harm either straight or lesbian women. And then, of course, the big one, engaging in sexually harassing behaviors or allowing others to do so. And then we have, of course, overt hostile behavior toward women. That's the really ugly stuff. And I'm distressed to find out how much this still does go on our campus. I mean, I've had women students in my office complaining about faculty members who'll stand up and say, oh, well, some of you guys come down and help her. Girls aren't good at math. And not intending to be funny, but quite serious about believing that the young women need help. Telling sexist jokes, this goes on a lot. Jokes that somehow combine sexuality and violence. A lot of stuff that the culture allows that when it comes into our classroom becomes part of creating what Sandler has called the chilly climate. Other issues faced by students of color, we already did that one. Sorry about that, whoops. Issues now faced by LGBT students. And this one's a little harder because you can't kind of look out there and see who these folks are necessarily. I mean, you really can't do that with the others. We just think we can, because we have to be really careful about assuming we can identify who's male and who's female or what race or ethnicity people are. We really don't know that either. A lot of times, though, our LGBT students are staying closeted because they perceive hostile environments on campus. I mean, did you all hear just what happened at U of O last week? That the swastikas were painted on their LGBT center. And so it's not just a perception. I mean, there still are places on our campuses that are hostile to LGBT people. Incredible numbers of LGBT students report threats, verbal harassment, and physical violence. I mean, it is just a part of what these kids experience. Especially in high school, LGBT kids have horrible experience. I mean, it's something like 80% experience some form of harassment in high school. And when they report it, I think it's like 10% ever have something done about it. So the problem's not even taken seriously. And so they come here, they've already had these experiences, so why in the world should they think they're safer on a college campus? And so when something like the event at the U of O happens, then the message goes out to these students that, yeah, you're right to be afraid. You're right to be aware that there is hostility towards you on campus. More often, though, our students really experience the subtle and indirect forms of discrimination. So, for example, assuming heterosexuality, that basically most folks assume you're straight unless you tell them otherwise. And so when we talk to a student, we say something about your boyfriend or your girlfriend, we may be making a huge assumption. Or if we talk to them and we assume their parents are mom and dad, because their parents might be mom and mom or dad and dad. And so we've got to watch our own assumptions about who's straight and who's not. Using language that maintains heteronormativity. I gave the example of talking about husband and wife as opposed to spouses or partners. The ways that we think about the nuclear family and mother and father maintains heteronormativity. Invisibility in the curriculum. Very seldom do we see gay issues raised. Now, of course, that varies on discipline to discipline, the extent to which that's an issue you would raise. I mean, in, a statistics class, unless you want to read some articles that use a statistical model to do some research on gay issues, which is actually kind of a cool way to get it in the conversation. But even if you walk into history classes or English classes, the classes in the humanities and the liberal arts where you would expect to see some of this, very often LGBT issues remain invisible in the curriculum. And then, of course, the disparaging comments. The research suggests that the classroom environment itself has an impact on students' coming out experiences. So if students are in classrooms and they feel supported, they feel that it's safe, they're much more likely to come out and to feel positive about that. But if the classrooms reinforce the notion that they're in danger, that the campus isn't safe, then they're going to be less likely to come out, or it's going to be a much more difficult process for them. And one of the things that you'll often see on college campuses is that as students come out, they get politically active. So you may have a student who early in the term is kind of getting ready and eventually comes out, and then by the end of the term, she might be wearing, multiple earrings and tattoos, and, she's out there with the Women's Center marching. And you have to be ready that that becomes a part of this personality. It becomes very, very important for a while as, you know, she's struggling to balance that out, you know. And so we have to recognize that what's going on with them personally ends up coming into our classrooms, and that we may see those changes and have to find those ways to support them. And rather than thinking she's going through some horrible identity crisis, find a way to be supportive of it. Oh, yeah, that's a great tattoo, yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What is the, I noticed there was a Q at the end of the acronym on the checklist. What is, I don't even know what that is.
There's queer and questioning. Yeah, it's LGBTQI, if you want to go the whole list. So it's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, and intersex is the whole thing. And queer is an interesting word. It's very regional as how appropriate it is to use that. Our campus, the students who would consider themselves to be that have reclaimed it. And so here you'll hear students talk about being queer. When what's now the Pride Center was first created, it was known as the Queer Resource Center. And it was created out of the Women's Center. And I remember there was a huge discussion among the students about what should they call it. And they decided they wanted to call it queer, because queer represents sort of the postmodern identities and the challenges to the binaries of gay and lesbian and straight, and you know, so they had their reasons. And I was back east doing some kind of presentation, and I was talking about this whole thing, and this woman, this New Englander, got really upset with me. She goes, well, I just find that word to be offensive. And I said, well, that's fine, but this is what the students in this group wanted to be called. Well, I shouldn't have to call them that. That makes me uncomfortable. I said, well, who do you think has the right to name them? And then she looks at me and goes, well, how would you like it if I called you queer? And I said, well, it depends on how you say it. You know, so for her, this became this word that was absolutely irredeemable based on sort of her regional and social context. So that one you have to be kind of careful with. Mm-hmm.
So what does it mean?
Broadly defined, it's basically any sort of non-normative sexual identity. So straight folks can have queer sex. You know, it's sort of getting away from the notion of male dominance, male-centered sexuality. So it can be people who might be considered gay, lesbian, bisexual, but generally queer is more fluid than that. So it will encompass those women who primarily are attracted to women but occasionally might sleep with men, for example, or people who just reject an identity that's so well defined. So it's really kind of an outgrowth of sort of the postmodern challenge to the notion that sexual identities are fixed. But again, you know, depends on where you are as to how well accepted that is.
I think too, like when I was 10 or something, that would have been a very offensive thing.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. I mean, if you talk to, you know, lesbians in their 50s, most of them freak out about it because it was such a derogatory term back when they would have been coming out when they were growing up. But my younger students sort of embrace it. They don't really want to be lesbians. I think lesbians are like, you know, short-haired women in comfortable shoes. I mean, that's, you know, they don't want to be that. And so it's sort of shifting around to figure this out, too, what people want to be called. The questioning part are those people who are sort of experimenting and trying to figure it out. And then intersex are those people who are born with some combination of sex characteristics of male and female. And there's a whole movement for intersex folks because typically if children are born and they have external sex characteristics of both sexes, the doctors treat it like a medical crisis and basically force the family to choose which way do you want to go. And so within the intersex community, there's a real push to let kids grow up with what they were born with. And then if they want to make a choice later, that's their choice, instead of having parents sort of force them to choosing, you know, what do we cut off or what do we add to? And usually it's cut off because it's easier to cut off than to build something. So. Students with disabilities. The hardest one, I think, with this are the students who have the hidden disabilities, the things we don't just see. Because a lot of times they'll get treated as if they're faking it or making it up, especially if they haven't been over to the Office for Students with Disabilities and gotten certified. The problem with that, though, is that's very expensive. And so students have to pay for that testing, and not all our students can afford that. And so we have to think as faculty, how are we going to deal with that? When we have students who say, look, I have a processing disability. It takes me a little longer to do something. Can I have a little extra time? But they're not certified. Now, if they're certified, we have to accommodate. We have to find those ways. But what do we do with those others? And so I think that there are a lot of questions we have to think about with students who come with these differences. A lot of times we don't even know what to do. I mean, we don't have any background. We don't have any training in how to work with students with disabilities. And so I think sometimes we struggle because we just are clueless. Again, we may have lower expectations because, well, somehow this person's in a wheelchair and therefore we assume the person can't think as clearly or something like that. We might view accommodations as compromising academic integrity. And this may be one of the biggest problems that students with disabilities face, that somehow we think that accommodating them so that the student has longer to take the test has somehow compromised the integrity of the test. And we really have to reshape our thinking and recognize that, for example, with a processing disability, a student can do the work, it's just going to take a little bit longer. But, does that mean the student doesn't know how to do it? The student's not smart enough? No, it just means it takes a little longer. I can think of something that happened here a while back. I don't know, I think it was in the chemistry department. Are any of you from College of Science would remember? The student who was a paraplegic and had to tell an assistant how to manipulate, the equipment, but knew how to do it. And there was actually a lawsuit for that student to get his degree because the faculty were saying, if you cannot manipulate them yourself, you're not a real scientist, you haven't completed this degree. And I mean, obviously the student won that one because the student had the information. The student the disability was not a problem as long as the student had an assistant who could actually manipulate the equipment. Pity, that's always a bad thing. People don't want to be pitied. It's easy to overlook students with disabilities. People with wheelchairs will talk about how people don't look at them. They don't speak to them. They sort of, because somehow we feel like looking at them makes us uncomfortable. So it becomes very easy to overlook folks.
Now, I'm going back several points, but I'm questioning my exam methodology because one of the features that I've incorporated into it is it's open book, open note. Mm-hmm. But they also have so much, a limited amount of time, and there's so many questions, they have to know it in order to get it done. Now, I have some students that have, DAS exceptions, so I handle that separately. But for students that aren't identified as having disabilities, am I putting them at a disadvantage? I have a rationale for doing it that way. Yeah. But I'm wondering, I hadn't considered that there was an expense associated with identifying as having a disability.
Yeah, and so what I've typically done is I have said to students, if you need an accommodation, you come tell me. I don't care if you've got the certification or not. I'm going to trust you. And at that point, I sort of feel like, if you cheat yourself, you cheat yourself. I can't worry so much about that. Because I think that for most students, there's enough stigma attached to admitting that you have a disability. I would say the problem is the opposite, that students who have disabilities underuse the accommodation.
So the issue I have is purely a personal one, that if someone comes to me and says, I am not identified as having a disability, but I have trouble with the testing format because I need extra time, I'm not paid to accommodate that. So that means I've got to take time I have to take unpaid time in order to accommodate that. Is there an expectation to do that? Or is there some other kind of accommodation?
No. If the student's not certified, if the student's not certified, there's no expectation to accommodate. And so the question becomes, what choices do I want to make? And I think you do have to weigh a lot of things. Peter, were you going to say something?
Dean of students about this very thing, and unless a student identifies themselves, the faculty member is under no obligation to make exceptions. But that gets into Susan's good point about it costs the students, and often for various reasons, particularly the invisible, like ADHD, things like that, they don't want to be identified as separate, and yet they'll come to the instructor because they need to survive, to do well. So, but official university policy, my understanding is if a student does not identify themselves, then the faculty member does not have to make any exceptions to them. But I, like Susan's approach is, I'll trust you if this is what you say. The issue may be other students start saying, wait a minute, you know, what's going on here? If you're going to do it for him, you got to do it for me.
Well, is there an accommodation then? I know with students that I've had who need extra time taking the exams, I provide the exam to a monitor, and then they just hand it back when it's done. So that's no big, you know, inconvenience for me. I just wait a little bit longer to get the result back, you know, and I get it within a day. Is that available to any student?
I don't know. I mean, typically we've used like having people come up into our department and sit there with our office person, basically serving as a monitor for us. I mean, you wouldn't want to do that if you have 5 people, but if it's just one person, so we've done that a time or two. Another thing that I try to do is create different enough assignments so that if a student really kind of struggles with one, say they struggle with the testing piece, they might shine on the written piece. And so there's not one piece alone that's going to cause them to do really badly in the class. And then that way, you know, if they have disabilities and they don't tell me, then they're not completely cutting themselves off from doing well in the class, because there are these multiple ways of demonstrating that they know the material and that they're competent with the methods of the class. But, you know, I can do that because I teach 20 to 25 of them. I'm not teaching 300 of them. And that brings a whole other set of issues, because, I mean, how else do you assess in those large classes, you know, other than Scantrons and stuff that certainly favors a kind of student who knows how to take that kind of test. And I know Peter's done some workshops about dealing with those sort of large classes, because I think they do create a whole other set of problems, and yet that's the reality. I mean, at least in my college, we're being told, make your classes even bigger. You know, don't teach 5 sections with 50 in it, teach 1 section with 250.
The point, though, Susan made earlier, too, is that as you think about from the very beginning, even not knowing who's in your class and the differences in learning styles, if you design your class with enough variety in them, you're going to probably hit most of those learning styles like colds. The other thing is now what we're finding out with student response systems, the clicker systems, we are able to accommodate a lot more students. They're able to feed into a system where they're anonymous and they're back there in seat 264, but they're still able to get their responses in and have their voice heard. And we think that's a positive response to those, particularly students who are shy or culturally not used to, you know, fighting for their spot on the stage. We think some of those things. So I go back to Susan's thing. Put a variety of kinds of assignments in your classes, and you're probably going to help a number of them out.
Yeah, we're going to shift the way we do things a little bit next year. So when we go to this model of having these much larger classes, that we're going to try to provide more TA assistance, so that we'll have some of the breakout groups, we'll have opportunities for additional help with the TAs, so that they're not just sort of stuck with come to the lecture and, you know, sort of be a face in the crowd. But I'll let you know how that goes. We'll see, because that's something we're certainly struggling with. I mean, how do you do feminist pedagogy when you have 200, 300 students sitting there? And I don't know how successful we'll be. I'll have to see. Okay, so I want to move from there. So those are just sort of an overview of some of the things that diverse students may experience in university classrooms. And so now I want to talk a little bit about things you can do to make your classroom more welcoming for all students. Just so you know, there's been a good bit of research that's been done about the benefits of diversity initiatives in higher education. And I think this is important to know, because what we realize is that spending this time thinking about diverse students and trying to make a difference actually improves things for everybody on campus. And so we find out that students have better relationships with one another. And this is all students, not just the students who are in the diverse populations. They express greater student satisfaction with their college experience as a whole. It certainly helps with issues of access and retention, decreases prejudicial attitudes and bias, greater acceptance, increased commitments, better norms of respect, multicultural competencies. The last two I think are very interesting, that research shows that students experience greater cognitive development when they are on campuses that have campus-wide diversity initiatives. And I think that probably is because students are experiencing difference, and we know that causes critical thinking. Students have to struggle with seeing other perspectives, with seeing different worldviews, with encountering things that are very different than what they've experienced or what they've learned. And there's increased academic success. So when we talk about these things, we really are talking about improving the campus for all of our students. One of the big ways, the thing that we control as faculty members, is the content of our courses. And so one of the things we can think about, and this is what in the DPD seminar we spend a lot of time doing, is how do I make these issues more a part of my content? And I have been amazed, in the liberal arts this is easy. I mean, it's kind of at the core of a lot of what we do. Hard sciences, this can get a little harder, but I've been amazed at what people have come up with in order to do this. For example, we have a DPD course in microbiology, and what they do is they trace how disease progresses at the microbial level based on these issues of difference of nation, social class, race, and gender, which I think is a sort of brilliant way to do that. So you're still learning microbiology, but you're doing it in this context. I mentioned before the statistics one. I was talking to a statistics professor at school in New York, and what she does is she teaches just the regular old stats course, but along the way she has them read papers that have used the statistical model she's trying to teach, but they use it to apply it to research about some diversity issue. And so even though in class they are learning statistical models, what they're reading about is diversity. The issue of contextual questions is really good. I've worked with the College of Engineering a bit over the past year, and this is one that becomes important for them, is that rather than simply learning the formulas sort of in and of themselves apart from the social context, is to teach them in a social context. So we did a thing where we looked at Hurricane Katrina, and we looked at the question of the levees, which in some ways, a pure engineering question, right? Well, except why did the levees break where they did? Why was it the particular people who lost their homes, who didn't get evacuated, who couldn't get water? Because they were black, they were poor, and they were women. So that's the other piece about Katrina that didn't get talked about. Is we talked about it a lot in terms of race, but it was also a gendered experience. So when we talk about making sure that those levees aren't going to fail, we can do it in this social context of what can you do with this. And the research shows that when engineering is taught that way, that women are more likely to stay in engineering because they see it as being useful for social justice. The examples we use, if we can draw from diverse groups in some ways, or that we can have guest speakers. And again, not just to come and talk about being black or being gay or being a woman, but just a guest speaker who's talking about whatever the topic of the day is, who by virtue of his or her presence says something about how this academic discipline belongs to all people. And then our pedagogical practices. We've talked about this a little bit. The notion of learning styles and making sure that we teach to a variety of learning styles. With David Kolb's 4 learning styles, he's developed a model where you teach around the 4 styles, and so it ends up that at some point in each class, a student gets to learn at his or her strength because you're moving through this model. Using cooperative learning activities is a way that really invites students in. There's a lot of research with women, for example, don't like the competitive atmosphere of engineering classes, for example, and they do much better if it's cooperative rather than competitive. Providing clear guidelines about how student work will be evaluated so they know, and this might go back to the question, John, that you had raised about testing and stuff, is letting them know up front, and then perhaps they will come and raise issues about what they need. Making sure about the real-world applications, helping students create cohorts or structured study groups, study centers, so that they're connecting with one another, they're getting the support that they need, and having contact with you outside of class. And this is an important one because what we see is that the students who already do well or the students who already feel very comfortable are going to be much more likely to come to your office hours, talk to you outside of class. The students who probably most need contact with you are not going to do that. And so we have to think about how do we engage students in that. And some faculty I know who have smaller classes, just require everybody to come by for an office appointment at some point. Again, 300 of them, what are you going to do? But at least they should feel that you're there if they want to come and make that connection. And then one thing that I suggest is that you specifically deal with diversity issues as you plan and implement your class. One of the things that I do is I have a set of guidelines that I distribute. They're actually attached to the syllabus. And mine are called Guidelines for Creating a Safe Space in the Women's Studies Classroom. And basically, it's a list of here's how we're going to behave in class. You would hope that by the time they're in college, you wouldn't need that. But I have found that actually becomes very helpful because in women's studies, we deal with a lot of hot topics. So we've got all these other dynamics plus, heated conversations around everything from abortion to gay marriage, you name it. And since I've started doing this, I've found that we have a very different kind of discussion in class. And students will feel very free if something's going wrong to pull that out and say, hey, look, we all promised we weren't going to do this. So let's not do this anymore, So that's very helpful. And then something as simple as having a statement of respect for diversity on the syllabus. So even if your class is completely hard science, there's nothing in it that could connect to any of this, but just to say on your syllabus, in this classroom we respect diversity, diverse points of view, diverse experiences. We expect people to be, respectful across gender, race. Because if you are a student from one of those groups where you're not used to assuming those things will be true for you in the classroom, it means something to see that. And that faculty member has set a tone for you. We think, okay, I belong in here. I'm going to be safer in here. I'm going to feel like my views are respected in here. Help students understand why attentiveness is important. Sorry about that. Should have been in any course there. Because a lot of times, when you're in a course, they'll go, well, this is a math class or this is a science class. Why are we talking about these issues? And so it's really important for you to help them make those connections and see why it's important for them to pay attention to issues of diversity. This one's really important, dealing with inappropriate classroom behavior as soon as it happens. Just as quickly as you can, so that you don't let a racist or a sexist or a heterosexist comment just sort of sit out there, because that really implies your approval of it. You don't want to humiliate the student who said it. What I often try to do is just problematize it. I'll say, okay, let's stop for a minute. Let's put that comment on the table. So it takes the focus off the student and puts it on the comment, and then we may talk about it. Why might someone find this offensive? Or do you know what the history of this word is? And so it can become a teachable moment for students.
Susan, sometimes it's just not that easy.
No, it's not.
And you see it, and you feel horrible, and you just don't know what to do. I was with the students for the retreat for the learning community, and I created this activity where they were in pairs, and one was pretending to be blind, and the other was pretending to be dumb. And we were at PBR breathing. And the dumb person was supposed to show the forest to the other person. And one pair had a Latino student and an openly gay person. The Latino student was able to see, but he was incapable of touching the gay student. Incapable. You could see the other students holding their arms, and I was with Tony inside, and I was saying, look, he cannot touch him. So at the end of the day, we switch and reverse the roles. The Latino student would rather go like this, running by himself, risking falling down, than allow the other student to touch him. So we had some moment to think about how did you feel when you were blind, and how did you feel, and then would you like to share? So the gay student raised a hand, and I said, okay, great, now we will talk about it. And he said, I was amazed how much I could see when I was blind. I could feel the texture on the ground, I could hear the sound of the water, I could feel the breeze of... So needless to say, I have not done anything. So what am I going to do with this?
What are you going to do with it?
Tony said that the reaction was so serious, so obvious, so open, that maybe the Latino student was dealing with some questioning of his own, and that maybe we should give him some time. But that's why I am here, to see if I get some time.
Did the other students notice it was going on?
No, well, the ones who were blind, they were blind, and the others were so worried about
their person. But yeah, because you don't want to let that go, because it's quite likely that gay student, that just reinforces everything that kid probably feels about sort of his tenuous position in society. Anyway, I mean, that would probably feel pretty horrible. Oh my gosh. Now maybe also that this person is kind of built up a tough skin and it's like, oh, well, if he didn't want to touch me, fine. It's homophobia and, but I don't know. I mean, that's a lot to ask somebody in that situation to sort of be able just to, let it roll as if it doesn't hurt. Because it does. Even when we build up that tough skin, those moments of being discriminated against hurt. So, and if you have any advice for Lauren, what would you do if it were you?
I would be interested just to hear from the two students individually or together, like why they chose the method they chose to go through that assignment. Because, you said that one student came out of it and was like, oh, I used all my other senses and I kind of, came to something. And I mean, I'm not saying that there wasn't something going on because it seemed like your observation was pretty, observant, obviously. But I just wonder if, someone would say something in that moment that would kind of clarify for you, Because sometimes someone has to come up against that and have someone say, oh, I observed you, showing this homophobic behavior, and kind of question them on it before they're going to, say it or question it themselves. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, obviously that would be maybe a difficult conversation, but hedging it on that kind of why did you choose that, way of doing it. Other students did it this way. You did it a unique and, kind of different way. What was the purpose? They might have some critical thinking response that you wouldn't,
Yeah, they could surprise you.
How long ago did it happen?
It will be 2 weeks ago tomorrow.
Okay.
Or
I was going to say, like, if it was yesterday and you're trying to
Yeah,
figure
no.
out that it's different than 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, I have let time pass. But these students will be together for 15 hours every week in the spring. So it will be like major time spent together. So,
Yeah, because that
So
can
they may
become
have other opportunities to address it.
well, I better create more
Yeah.
opportunities.
And then you have enough, you will likely have other opportunities to address it in a more immediate fashion. And if you address it 2 weeks later, my perspective on that is that you're kind of dredging out. You've lost the immediacy, the learning opportunity, but then now you're aware of it, and you can look for that as an opportunity and address it in the moment, as opposed to trying to, oh, and you remember a month ago when this happened? This is what I saw. Because then that makes the teacher look like, or the instructor look like they've got some kind of an agenda.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because you're right, because you have the luxury of having them, I'll call it a luxury, of having them so much longer than we generally have students. That I think John's right, yeah, that you're probably going to get plenty of opportunities to sort of watch for it and come back to it. Yeah. I mean, what you see, we're going to run into this stuff, and sometimes we're going to fall flat on our faces. I mean, that's one thing I learned really quickly when I started teaching, is that with the best of intentions, I'm still going to really screw things up every once in a while. But teaching's a very forgiving profession in a lot of ways, as long as you don't do something like so horrible. but our basic mistakes that we make, we learn from them and we don't do it again. I mean, I typically find new mistakes to make, but I don't often repeat the old ones. And so I think it's important that we do reflect on these things and that we learn from them. But then we give ourselves permission to do everything I've talked about and know that, we learn from it, we recover from it, we improve our teaching from it. So we can't beat ourselves up too much when we don't know what to do or when we do the wrong thing. Because students tend to be pretty forgiving with that stuff too. I mean, they tend to give us more chances to do it right. Let's see. And this is true for all this, is to use humor when it's appropriate, but you have to always be careful with humor because humor shouldn't be at the expense of a particular group. And so, you don't want to be seen as like being so serious about everything all the time. But on the other hand, you also don't want to use deprecating humor that harms people. And that's, again, one of those things where we have to learn balance. We have to model acceptance of diversity and interest in diversity issues for our students, so they recognize that we are open to people who are different from ourselves. The issue of being sensitive to terminology, we've already talked about with the issue of queer and all the other possible identities. And the best thing with that, and that's true, if you're talking about Black or African American, if you're talking about, Latino, Latina, Chicano, Mexican, ask people what term they prefer, because it varies. You're never going to say the right term all the time because different individuals have different feelings about it. And I think what's more important to people within groups is that you're sensitive enough to recognize there are different terms, and you want to make sure you use the one that's most appropriate. And then also it's helpful, and again, this is true of all these, to be aware of campus resources for folks so that we can refer people. So knowing that Stephen Leiter's there, that there's a women's center, that there's a Black Cultural Center, Cesar Chavez, and so on and so forth, that there are offices that deal with these different issues. Because a lot of times this stuff's going to be outside of our expertise. There are going to be issues that are beyond what we can deal with. And so it's good to know where to send students. And if you don't know, it's good to know who to call. And so generally you can call like Larry Roper's office, which is always going to be very helpful with student issues, and they can refer you in the right direction. So again, some specific things. As we've talked about, there are general things we can do for all students, and then there's some specific things we can do for the different populations we've talked about. So for students of color, we ourselves should become more informed about the histories and cultures of other groups, just so that we know more. So we're not coming in only with the particular history and culture of our own groups. Again, we talked about keeping your expectations high, being sensitive to terminology. Don't try to protect any group of students, because again, that has that sort of paternalizing effect of, you know, you can't really take care of yourself, so I'm going to step in and take care of you. This one's good. Don't assume that all students will recognize cultural, literary, or historical references familiar to you. This is also a generational thing, you know. I remember once, a couple of years ago, I was talking about Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. And my students just looked at me, and I said, "What is wrong with you? Where were you in 1991? And they were like, "We were in preschool." I was like, okay. Now they wouldn't even have been born yet, but this is especially true that you know, as a white person, I may have a whole set of other references that I would assume to be true, and that I would think everybody should know, but say particularly if you're dealing with international students, you know, why would they necessarily know those things? Again, this sort of making competitive learning environments at least less intimidating. If we can't go completely to cooperative learning, are there ways we can make the competition itself a little less intimidating? And then monitoring group work so that groups do not reproduce the social dynamics of exclusion or marginalization. So that you don't have groups where suddenly all the white kids are dominating, where all the male kids are dominating, where, you know, any person who's part of a diverse group gets sort of pushed to the outside. Use positive examples from diverse racial and ethnic groups. And sometimes this is going to mean some extra work for us because likely in our very traditional dominant culture educations, we didn't learn this stuff. And so we may have to go and look for it. Be sure to respond to racialized or racist comments. Don't ask students to speak for their groups. Paying attention to the intersections of race with gender and sexual identity. And that's really important because Black men and Black women have different experiences of racism. Latinos and Latinas have different experiences of racism. And the same thing would be true like among women. So that, say, white women and Latinas and Black women and women of Asian descent have different experiences of sexism based on their race. Attend educational and cultural events put on by student groups. I mean, that will speak loads to your commitments if students see you at these sorts of events and activities. Problematize whiteness. Talk about whiteness. Because since whiteness is the norm, it sort of gets assumed. And so when we talk about race, we automatically assume we're talking about, you know, Asian, Latino, Black, Native American. But whiteness is a race too. It's a very problematic race. And so you can actually bring that up to help students in the dominant groups really begin to see the privilege that attaches to whiteness. And then apologize if you make a mistake. There's nothing like a good "I'm sorry" if you screw up, you know, just to smooth things over. I think sometimes the biggest mistake we make is trying to defend ourselves when we, with the best of intentions, do something that's still a problem. Again, we go back to Bernice Sandler about ways to warm up the chilly climate for women. She says to look at your teaching behaviors and see which students get the best and most responses out of you. And so sometimes faculty have had a peer observer come and sort of record who are you calling on, how are you responding, or get yourself videotaped and then watch. That one always makes me nervous. It's like I told them, I don't know that I really want to see this thing. Use praise as a deliberate strategy coupled with feedback about the quality of work. So again, making sure that we give those equal responses to women and that we also are offering praise to women students. Give criticism in the form of a question where possible. Women students are very, very sensitive to criticism coming from powerful figures, from authority figures. And so are there ways we can ask questions to help them think more critically about what they're not doing as well as they should? Don't always call on the first hand that goes up. Coach females as well as males, because again, we have that inclination to spend more of the out-of-class time with the students who are more dominant. Yeah, looking at all the students, not just the best and the brightest, not just the white, not just the male. Listen attentively to all students when they speak, even if their answer is wrong. And then the last part of that's really hard sometimes. If they speak English as a second language and it's heavily accented, you can often watch other students, they just shut down, they don't listen. I mean, I remember once when I was teaching religion, I had a student who was from Vietnam and a student who was from Kuwait, and both of them had really heavily accented English, and they got into an argument in my religion class, and I was watching the rest of the class glaze over. Even though I thought they were having a very interesting argument and making really good points, but it was hard, even for me as the instructor, to stay with it and to force myself to listen that carefully. But again, I think that's one of those behaviors that we can model for our students, that even if you're speaking with a heavily accented English, I'm going to pay you the respect to listen carefully to you, to ask questions, to clarify, to make sure I've understood you. Intervene when male students show disrespect, so the interrupting behaviors, the sexist comments, the sexualizing comments. Don't allow students to interrupt each other. Use small groups, again, the cooperative learning. Avoiding stories, jokes, comments that denigrate women and girls. Attributing comments and contributions to women as much as to men. Again, and this is important. Sometimes women in our class will speak in styles that are much more hesitant. And actually, I mean, it drives me crazy. For example, now I don't know if this is right or not, and I'm really sorry, but I'm not supposed to say, just say it. Now, in women's studies, I'm likely to say that to them because for me, part of it is to empower them to have their own voice. But it's very often easy for us then not to want to pay attention to those comments because they've so apologized them away that we're thinking, well, they must not be very important. Even you don't believe in your own comments. But those are the ways women have been taught to speak. Just to say something to most women feels very harsh because we're supposed to be polite and nice and, not talk in those sort of pointed and decided ways. And yet, how do we speak in the university? What kind of speech patterns do we reward? The ones that are direct, the ones where I have an opinion, I can back it up, I'm going to give it to you, here it is. And so we have to be aware of those differences in speech patterns. Using the parallel terminology, so men and women. Using he or she as opposed to he, mankind. Not grouping students by gender. Don't set up little competitions between the men and the women because all that just feeds into these notions of competition between men and women. Don't make these comments that end up actually being insults. Ask them the same kinds of questions and make sure that you call the women by their names as much as you do the men. Because again, it would be, like I said, be John and you in the blue shirt. And that's a very typical pattern that we would have as instructors. Things you can do to help LGBT students feel welcome. Again, learn more about LGBT issues and concerns. I mean, that will speak volumes to a student if you're up on those issues and you just know enough to talk about them. That will say you're committed, that you care about it. Again, don't assume people are heterosexual. Use inclusive language. Challenge name-calling and harassment. So when you hear oh, that's so gay, or he's such a fag, say something about it. Those are not acceptable patterns of speech for the classroom. Include LGBT people in your statement of support for diversity. Consider inviting out LGBT people when you consider your guest speakers. So people who talk about, what's it like to be, a gay male engineer? What's it like to be a lesbian veterinarian? I mean, how do those things come into play? How might your sexual identity work in those circumstances. Don't ever out anybody, but especially don't out students. You know, if they want to come out, they'll do so. And then if you are LGBT, you might consider coming out. Now, you've got some things to weigh there. I mean, is it safe for you and your unit to do so? And I think on this campus that varies. I mean, I think there's some places where it's very safe to come out. I think there are others where it might be a problem. And I think you have to weigh that. But again, that says a lot to a student who is LGBT sitting out there if they know that you are too. Because then they can recognize, first of all, well, gee, there's a successful, respected LGBT person up there. I'm not a bad person. You know, I'm not a sinner going to hell just because of this. You know, look, I can be successful. And it also lets them know, here's somewhere you can go. Here's where you can get support. And then finally, helping students with disabilities. The detailed course syllabus, and if you can have it, this is a hard one, have it before the term begins so that students can get it. And then if they need some help, you know, getting it in bigger typeface or getting somebody to read it, that's there. You know, again, put it on the syllabus. You know that they're welcome to come and meet with you, to come talk to you about things that they might need, to let you know what their issues are. Spell out the expectations very clearly. Minimize distractions in the classroom. Use multisensory teaching, and again, it's like, and that's going to benefit everybody. But the more ways you can engage the senses, the more ways you can create experiences, the better students are going to learn. Be concrete. You know, I think for a lot of us who are faculty members, we're pretty good at abstract thinking, but our students may not be as good at that. So we should be concrete about stuff. Make sure there's time for questions and answers, that we provide review sessions. Make sure that we give things both orally and in written form, because we're going to have some students who, again, they process things slowly when they hear them, so they need to see them written down. You know, for students like who are ADHD, you know, rather than having one long assignment where they're going to have to spend a lot of time at once, break it up into more manageable units. Be aware that not everybody wants to read out loud, and that people have different levels of comfort with that. You learn to use the technologies, because there's some great stuff out there, or at least know the folks on campus who can help you use the technology, or help your students use that. And then, you know, kind of figure out with the exams ways that you can help them be successful. So show them examples of the kind of questions you're going to ask and what a good answer would look like. I mean, that's a huge problem. Some of our students have never seen what a good exam answer looks like, or what a good paper looks like. And I've discovered a lot of times that if I show them that before they start the assignment, like, here was a great paper that somebody wrote for me last term, then they have a better sense of what that may look like. And then this is when we talk about the sort of the alternative methods. If we can find ways, can they show us that they know this stuff, but maybe in a different way? You know, so that we don't feel like we're compromising any academic integrity, but we're really giving them a chance to succeed by showing that they know what the other students know. They just may need another way to express that to us. And then again, encourage them to use the Office for Students with Disabilities. Tracy Bentley Talent's fabulous, and she's got all sorts of stuff she can offer over there if they go and chat with her. So,
if they don't have the certification that they...
I think she can chat with it. She's limited in what she can do, but she can certainly be helpful in a lot of ways anyway, yeah. So, what I'd like you to do now is sort of take a moment and do a little personal assessment and see how you're doing in relation to some of these things. I'm probably not modeling good behavior here because I know I'm rushing you, but what I'd like for you to do now, however far you got, is to get into groups around the tables and talk about what you came up with. So talk about, here are the things that I thought I did well, here are the things that I saw maybe I can work on, or I'm not even sure what this one meant, what the heck is she talking about, but spend a few minutes in groups doing that, so just join a table. What are some of the issues that have arisen as you've talked in your small groups? What are some of the more interesting or perplexing or inspiring things that have come up? Oh, sure, now you get quiet. All right. Was that a hand I saw, Kathleen?
Well, one of the things that I came upon in our discussion was really realizing that how we've constructed diversity isn't specifying religious diversity, it isn't specifying class, or even ideological or intellectual diversity.
Yeah, and you may have missed the comment I made at the very beginning, which is that I purposefully narrowed it down, but you're right. But age is another one that we should pay attention. Nation of origin is another one. So there are a lot of others we could do this and have a whole other session that looked at all of those. In fact, I have an entire 2-hour workshop that I do sometimes on dealing with religiously conservative students and sort of this separate kinds of issues they bring to the classroom and the challenges that can present. Yeah. So we have to keep in mind, like I said, yeah, this is limited. This is a sample of the sort of diversity issues that we have to keep in mind as we're teaching. So thank you for...
You know, and that then brings to mind our assumptions as instructors, because often I hear people using the religious right in derogatory terms, and we have a very strong student population from that perspective and persuasion. So helping that voice feel comfortable amidst all these perspectives, I think is something we need to also look at as instructors.
Yeah, because, you know, we all bring our ideological bents to the classroom. And I mean, what I do is overtly politicized, and I don't make any apology for that. And yet, part of that sort of political ideology for me, though, is I don't want in any way, though, to make a student feel not welcomed in my classroom because of differences that we have. Because for me, I'm willing to engage any idea. You know, what I don't want to do is sort of the name calling and the one-upmanship and the sort of gotcha stuff. You know, and that's kind of in those guidelines for creating a safe space. But I think it's very important that even while we have our points of view, and you know, in my case, in ethnic studies, you know, we're in disciplines that do have an ideological perspective. It's still important to value those diverse voices and those students who represent them, who are in our classrooms. And that can be a balancing act. You know, what do you do in women's studies with the anti-choice student? You know, or what do you do with the student in women's studies who thinks gay people are going to hell? And how do you treat them as full humans, even as from the disciplinary perspective, you're challenging the idea? It's like having a creationist in your science. Ah, okay, you probably run into this, yeah.
Luckily not directly, but in human anatomy it comes up quite a bit.
Yeah, because you're trying to talk about how things evolved the way they did, and God created them that way, finished product, right? Yeah, and so it's that balance between challenging ideas and respecting persons. And that's always tough. Because sometimes we all go home, we just want to pull our hair out, right? Oh my gosh, how could that person think this? And, you know, but we can't take that to the classroom and treat them in that way, even if we want to go home and yell about it. Good. Other things that came up that were like I said, interesting or perplexing?
I guess one thing that